I study social evolution. I have a rather checkered, mixed background in the sense that I started as a psychologist, became a zoologist, and became after that an anthropologist, and then went back to psychology and did the circuit again. I think I'm on the third time round at this point. So I can never decide where I belong. Psychology is where I am now. But I'm interested in principally not only, well, I also work on mammals in general, primates in particular, and to a large extent, increasingly on humans as well. But it's trying to understand the basic mechanisms that make social life possible. And one of the things we've discovered, and really only within the last 5 years, that social life is probably the single most challenging and complex problem in the universe. And my apologies to the physicists who think that cosmology is complicated. Social life really is extremely stressful for all mammals, and probably the birds too, but particularly mammals. It is so stressful for mammals that the stress destabilizes female menstrual cycle endocrinology, and females very quickly become infertile. So much so that for the kind of basic mammal, Matthew showed a basic mammal, the rat, but for a lot more other species, they cannot live in groups with more than about 5 females, because if there are, all the females eventually become infertile very quickly. By that point, all the females are infertile. So the only way species like primates and some ungulates and other species have been able to evolve large groups to live in, and that's obviously ourselves, is to find ways to manage the stresses of living in close proximity to other people. And it's that mechanism I'm really going to talk about. And particularly so in this context, because I think, or I suspect, we suspect that it's what lies at the bottom of the very problem that we're all here to talk about. So the question I'll start with is simply, how is it that primates create their relationships with each other, create their friendships with each other, and through those friendships, groupings, larger groups that are stable and survive through time rather than constantly breaking up? And the answer is a twofold component. They're psychological mechanisms, or what psychologists would call a two-process mechanism. It involves two parts of the brain operating independently of each other, but in tandem and complementary to each other. One is the product of all this stuff here, which they spend an inordinate amount of time doing. This species here, which I actually did my PhD research on many, many years ago, somewhat before the dinosaurs went extinct. They spend 20% of their day engaged in this activity, social grooming. It is hugely, hugely important to them. What that does is both, and I'll show you in a minute, allows the reduction of tension, if you like, and stress, so that the animals can stay together, and because it's rewarding, keep coming back for it. And that then allows them to, the other half of the system, which is the cognitive mechanism, which is why they have a big brain, to kind of process and manage all these complex relationships that they have amongst themselves. Okay, so this is the bit we're going to be interested in. I'm not going to say anything at all about the cognitive component. They spend a lot of time engaged in social grooming. It's leafing through the fur. If you watch them doing it, one hand is leafing the fur over so you can see the bare skin underneath, and the other hand is picking bits of grass and twigs and what have you, and scabs and other things. Wild primates don't actually have parasites. You have to live in a house to have parasites or a nest. But wild primates really don't have bears. They'll have the odd tick, for example, which they might try and pull off. So they do that. Of course, we've lost our hair, so we don't have the hair to groom. But on the other hand, as we've just been listening to, we spend an inordinate amount of time instead with your hairdresser doing stuff. But we kind of forget because it's not obvious to us. It kind of goes on below what I call the horizon of consciousness, because our world is so dominated by vision and by language, we don't notice what's going on beneath it. But we spend an awful lot of time doing this kind of stuff when we're engaged in conversations with our friends and family and so on. An awful lot of time. It's happening constantly. We did, to try and understand this a little bit more, we did a survey basically around the whole of Europe. So it covered the UK to Russia, when we were allowed to collect data from Russia, so you can tell how old this was, and Finland to Italy, and then my Finnish collaborators who really instigated the project got some Japanese collaborators to do the study in Japan as well. This is one of the diagrams. The question was simply, where are you happy to be touched by somebody else on your body, painted in on the graph pad, as it were, and then they had to tell us, or do this in the context of very specific individuals. Think of a female friend of yours, think of a male acquaintance, think of a random stranger you've never met. And this is what's listed here, as it were. So this is your partner, romantic partner, essentially, your friends, your mum, your dad, sisters, brothers, aunts and uncles, going out through friends, general acquaintances, out to strangers. And the whiter it is, the more happy you are to touch that person on those parts of the body and to be touched by them. And you can see that in general, for relatively close relationships out to about cousins, quite a lot. There are areas of the body that become untouchable, as it were. But there are big chunks of the body which we do spend a lot of time touching. When you're having a conversation with them, you put an arm around the shoulder, you touch them, stroke their arm and so on. But there comes a point roundabout, we think this is about 50 people in your acquaintance and family circle, where it transitions very sharply into, you're allowed to touch my hands, but nowhere else, right? And this is not just in uptight Britain. This is all over Europe, and it's exactly the same picture in Japan. I'll ask you a little teaser here, and who you think the most touchy-feely people in Europe are. And it's obviously not the British, right? And you're probably going to say, oh, the Italians or the French, yeah? It's not. It's the Finns. Can you believe it? The answer, of course, is very simple. If you spent as much time as the Finns spend naked in saunas, I say no more. Okay, so Francis showed you half of this slide earlier this morning. He showed you this slide, he didn't actually show you the data. This is Barry Cavern's original study carried out in Cambridge on Talapoin monkeys. These are actually Japanese macaques. But I draw your attention to the fact that this one being groomed here, this female being groomed, is absolutely fast asleep, right? Absolutely fast asleep. It's consequent. It happens very regularly with these species that spend a lot of time grooming. What Barry Cavern showed, and he showed it pharmacologically, was that if you gave animals a saline injection, which is not doing anything in the body at all, grooming, and this is just being measured in terms of the numbers of grooming partners per hour or so of the experiment. Grooming was at generally at a very high rate. It doesn't look like it there, but it is. But if you gave them a morphine injection, which locks onto the receptor sites in the brain for endorphins, suddenly they lose interest. And conversely, if you give them an opiate blocker, naltrexone, which also locks onto the endorphin receptor sites in the brain, but doesn't have any pharmacological effect, it's pharmacologically neutral, they just can't get enough grooming. So this is what's driving us to be social. This is what's causing drug addicts, opiate drug addicts, to give up on the social world and become asocial. We're getting our kicks, pharmacological kicks, if you like, socially, they're doing it on their own and losing all the social benefits thereof is really the important thing. But it turns out that this really underpins the whole mechanism of what's going on in grooming. We've shown this in humans. This is a PET scan study. All our PET scan studies are carried out by our collaborators in Finland. So they do other things besides saunas. But this is, so we'd have people in the PET scanner. They're horrid experiments to do, and you have to do 2 of them, and you're injecting radioactive dyes into the brain, basically through the vein system, blood system. So they're there all day because you can't have these too close together. But we then got their partners stroking them, and because they're Finns, remember, they don't get excited about anything, and on top of that, nothing above the neck, nothing below the belt, right? Just stroking, casually stroking here at the requisite 3 centimeters per second that Francis told you about this morning. This is their brains going absolutely crazy. These are all the endorphin receptor sites lighting up, as it were. And you can see it's all over the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex up here, big chunks of the parietal cortex back in here, bits and pieces down here. Nothing back in the back end of the brain or in the cerebellum particularly here. Back end of the brain is all vision, so why would it? This is the heavy social processing stuff, and where all that emotion processing and social computation goes on. So we respond in exactly the same way to grooming as monkeys do, only what we've done is replace it, grooming, leafing through the fur, with stroking, right, and hugging and caressing and so on. Here's the mechanism. It's a slightly more, I hope, comprehensible graph than the one Francis showed you this morning, but it says the same thing. You've got these 2 classes of neural systems. The general peripheral neural systems, categorized here by the pain system, which are very, very fast. The neurons are myelinated, so they've got this kind of fatty insulating cover on, rather like you have on an electric wire. Allows them to run very fast. It goes up to the somatosensory cortex. A message comes flashing back down saying, pull your hand out of the fire, quick, right? And before anything dangerous happens. The other set, which, as he mentioned, we only recently discovered, really in the late 90s, is this set of CT neurons, the afferent C tactiles, which are very slow because they're unmyelinated. They have no fatty covering, so they're extremely slow. They go up into the insular cortex, which is one of the sources of endorphin production, and there's no return loop because all they're designed to do is trigger the endorphin system, basically. Endorphin system, remember, is part of the brain's pain management system. It's the slow pain management system, as it were. This is the fast pain management system. This is the slow pain management system. But what it produces is this extraordinary sense of relaxation. It's an opiate. That's where the name comes from. So endorphins are a contraction of endogenous morphine, meaning the brain's own morphine, because chemically it's very, very similar. There are just a few key bits different, which is what prevents us getting addicted to endorphins, whereas we get addicted to opium and morphine and so on in the ways that everybody knows about these days. But this stuff you don't get addicted to, you don't get habituated to it. You don't necessarily need more and more and more every time you do it. It works perfectly well every time. But it creates this classic opiate sort of sense, a sense of relaxation, a sense of calmness, a feeling of being at peace. You get this intense sense of self-other merging, that you feel very kind of part of the mind of the person who's doing this activity, grooming, with you. It creates a sense of trust, and it creates a very strong sense of being bonded to that person. And that sense of bondedness is what creates this sense of reciprocity and altruism and so on that we feel towards those members of our social networks. Okay. The problem, if you like, our ancestors had was this stuff works perfectly well for monkeys, and you can see the amount of grooming time goes up as group sizes go up. They're not necessarily grooming more individuals in the group. They're just grooming their key partners, grooming partners more to make sure those friendships make more, which is what protects them from the stresses of living in the group. But we hit an upper, put it this way, there appears to be an upper barrier on the size of groups you can maintain through this grooming mechanism. And that size of group is at about 50. And so when our ancestors, if you like, were pushing our group size up beyond that to the sizes of groups we live in historically and now, they had to, in effect, had to find other mechanisms for triggering the endorphin system. The problem with any touch-based system is it's very intimate. You only do it, as you could see on the body pictures, you only do it with people you have meaningful relationships with. You don't feel comfortable about doing it with other people. But what we had, so, that's a consequence. That's what makes grooming one-on-one. If you don't believe me, I merely invite you. I'm not sure you can do it anymore because cinemas have these sort of beds in that you watch the thing in now. But when they had proper seats, I would invite you to go and, with 2 other people, and try cuddling them both in the back row. Right? And I'll bet you any number of bottles of champagne you can get into this room that one of them will leave within 10 minutes. And they will be very cross. Right? Because you've not been paying attention to them. You've been giving too much attention to the other person. So it's that intimacy of physical contact that limits its capacity to create big groups. So we had to break through that barrier. What we needed was ways of having a bigger grooming circle, simultaneous grooming circle, and that means not using physical contact, virtual grooming. And this is how we did it. We discovered these behaviors. They all trigger the endorphin system. It's what I call our social toolkit. The earliest one for sure is laughter, because it is the only bit that's genetic in its basis. But we share it with the great apes. We've just adapted it from the great ape and general monkey form of laughter so as to make it much more stressful on the body and therefore trigger the endorphin system more. Sometime around 500, 600,000 years ago, archaic humans brought this into play when they discovered that singing and dancing trigger the endorphin system, particularly when you do them in synchrony and you do them as a group. And then with the evolution of language, which in terms of language as we know it, modern complicated languages only go back as far as our own species, that's about 200,000 years. The rituals of religion, feasting, eating together socially, and drinking alcohol. Alcohol is a major trigger of the endorphin system. It's not actually the alcohol you get addicted to, it's the endorphins, the endorphin system. So those of you who've been to alcohol clinics will know that what they do is give you naltrexone, which blocks the receptor sites and gives you cold turkey and gets you off it. And storytelling, emotional storytelling. And that's why we like tragedies and keep going back to tragedies. Why would you go back to tragedy when watch Shakespeare tragedy or any other tragedy when you've just spent an hour crying? The answer is we feel psychological pain in exactly the same bit of the brain as we feel physical pain, and that's triggering the endorphin system. We've done imaging experiments for a lot of these. We've done naltrexone experiments for a lot of these. We've used pain threshold changes as proxies for all of them, and we ask. What we show is that any of these trigger the endorphin system, particularly when you do it in company, and they create this deep, deep sense of bonding. And there are all sorts of other ways of doing it, because it's basically physical exercise, that the muscles being moved by something, either by hand or by you. All of these will trigger the endorphin system. We've actually done experiments on the university's boat crew, which I'm sure didn't get out very well. But exercising in the gym, yoga, the reason you get into yoga, yoga works is because it's triggering the endorphin system. It's the breathing control that does it, right? Jogging, And of course, you see it a lot in animals in zoos, where they're pacing round and round and round, or indeed even doing exactly what humans do, tearing their hair out because they're intensely bored. So I guess the key message here is it's a natural system. The kind of hair pulling and skin pulling and so on are just exploiting a perfectly natural system, which is part of our social toolkit, the way we build and maintain friendships. It's not something that unusual. It has become kind of, if you like, maladapted in that sense because of the intensity with which it's being done. But I think you need to remember it is the mechanism itself is part of our natural social toolkit. Thank you very much.